There are two things. I didn't come to politics as a SPAD. I ran for 10 years a magazine, you could say a bit like the current mayor, Boris Johnson, as editor, as producer, as director. But as the last 5 years as an MP, my job has been to deliver from government a good deal for my constituents. And it's not, as mayor, your job is to secure a good deal from government, because if we don't get that good deal, we're not going to get the expansion of our transport network, for example, that underpins the London economy and unlocks the land we're going to need to deal with the housing crisis.
But how can you understand the kind of jeopardy of penury that many people face in London? Because through no fault of your own, and it's not casting an aspersion on your integrity, you've never faced that life.
But you see, the logic of the argument that you're using, I understand why you asked the question, clearly, but the logic of that argument is that no one could ever truly represent London. Because if you have to have personal direct experience of every problem you confront, no one could be an MP, no one could be a councillor. The first people, but I want to make this point, the first people I spoke to as an MP in Richmond Park and North Kingston were people who had problems which you've never had to deal with, almost none of your viewers have had to deal with.
One of the biggest problems for ordinary Londoners is they just cannot afford to live in London anymore. Right. Now, you've promised 200,000 homes.
I said we need 50,000 homes a year.
Well, exactly, over the term. But my point is that they may be affordable when they're built, but how can you make sure they're still affordable 2, 3, 4 years later?
Well, I mean, affordable has become a fraud. I mean, you have affordable homes being sold, in some cases, not that far off £1 million. So
how do you stop it?
So you need to question the terms. This is a term that's been used by politicians, which has become almost meaningless. If you want to solve the housing crisis in London, which means making houses affordable, you've got to close the gap between supply and demand. Doesn't matter what else you do, if you don't close the gap between supply and demand, the prices will always be unsustainable. So the job is to build, and to build for Londoners. And to do that, you need three things. You need land, you need planning, and you need finance. We have stacks of land in London which is not used. TfL alone owns the equivalent of land. It would be, if you put it all together, it would be the size of Camden.
So you would force that free land to be sold at brownfield for housing?
Absolutely have to take this. Some of that land is already accounted for, clearly, and we don't know the full extent. There's a report which is due at the end of the year, a land commission, which will tell us how much land is available. But we know there is a lot of brownfield land.
A touchstone for Zac Goldsmith has been the third runway at Heathrow.
Yeah.
If the government announces that third runway at Heathrow next month, will you resign the candidacy for mayor and stand as an independent?
No, because the reason and the premise of your question is that I have promised to step down as an MP if my party gives a green light to Heathrow expansion.
And you presumably will do that?
And that's what I said I would do in 2008. And the reason I said I would do that was very simple. It was because people liked what David Cameron said, no ifs, no buts, there'll be no Heathrow expansion. But they didn't believe him, because he's a politician and people don't believe politicians. So I made that pledge. I said to people, if you vote for me and that promise is broken, you will have a chance to vote again, because I'll trigger a by-election. It was a promise I made, and it's a promise I would be obliged to keep. It's not a promise I'm particularly happy exists, but it's a very clear promise that I made, so therefore, of course, I would honour it.
So do you regret now making that promise?
No, I mean, it's academic. I made the promise in 2008.
Was it part of your youthful rebellion?
No, not at all. It was, I think, a necessary promise to make to people who've been lied to so often about Heathrow. They needed to have a reassurance. So that was the reason I made the promise.
I understand. You make that promise, and you say you're going to resign as a Tory MP, but yet you would be a Conservative mayor if you could be in London. Yeah. So you support the idea of the Conservatives in the mayoral sense, but not in the Westminster sense.
But it's not. That's not the
that's
reason.
Crazy.
It's not. With respect, you're misunderstanding the reason I made the promise, which was simply to give people an opportunity to cast their vote again if they've been misled. That's why I made the promise in 2008. I have not made that promise in relation to the mayoralty. You could argue that triggering a by-election in Richmond Park and North Kingston is not particularly helpful in the context of the battle against Heathrow expansion. But it is a promise I made, and it's a promise that I would not attempt to wriggle out of. But as mayor, among other things, I would be able to be an advocate for a more sensible solution. But I have to tell you that Heathrow is a very small part of the mayoral programme. This is, I would love it if 2 months from now this issue is resolved and I never have to talk about Heathrow again.
Would you want to retain more of London's taxes? Is that a key?
Yes, absolutely. London needs to be treated like a grown-up city. New York keeps 50% of the taxes that it raises. London keeps around 7% of the taxes it raises, which means that we generate vast revenue for the government, and we have to go cap in hand and beg for some of that money back to pay for infrastructure that is necessary for London. That's wrong. So yes, I absolutely advocate greater decentralisation.
Zac Goldsmith, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.